Hello, my name is Ashley Krider, and I'm a senior project associate with Policy Research Associates. We are a woman-owned small business based near Albany, New York, upstate New York, and we've provided technical assistance, policy analysis, research, and training since 1987. Our specific focus areas span behavioral health, wellness and trauma, homelessness and housing, juvenile justice, benefits access, veterans and their families. So I've worked at Policy Research, or PRA, since 2012 and focused primarily on the intersection of the adult criminal justice system and behavioral health, so mental health and substance use. And I work with communities across the country, including diversion away from the criminal justice system and toward community-based services where appropriate. I currently coordinate behavioral health technical assistance to the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge, which provides support to local leaders in over 50 jurisdictions around the country, specifically around over-incarceration in jails. And prior to joining PRA, I worked in forensic services at the New York State Office of Mental Health. So I'm very excited to join the robust lineup of presenters during this conference and share some information on what I think is a very important and timely topic. So my session is entitled Unbundling Police Funding and Building the Right Response. A couple of things before I start. PRA is not an advocacy organization, but we often work with law enforcement and train them through our focus on response to individuals with behavioral health needs in the community. So I'm privileged to gain both a broad view of national best practices and models through this work, but also to engage with local jurisdictions around what their gaps and opportunities are. So through all this, we hear a lot of feedback about the challenges officers face in responding to individuals in crisis, especially where there are few options for diversion or deflection. We also know that people with mental illness and disabilities represent a disproportionate number of people arrested and jailed each year. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center, people with untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. In the same vein, approximately 25% of people killed by police have a serious mental illness. Police do not have the specific in-depth training to assess or treat mental illness, nor to accommodate other disabilities in most cases. We're also aware of the racial disparities in police use of deadly force against both armed and unarmed individuals. People identifying as Black, Indigenous, or people of color have significantly higher rates of fatal police shootings compared to people who are white. A study in the Washington Post also found that racial disparities in non-fatal police shootings were even more pronounced than in fatal police shootings. So while these are certainly not new problems, the 2020 murder of George Floyd provoked national attention around the issue of law enforcement reform. Since then, many jurisdictions have pledged or made significant changes to law enforcement funding, including reallocating funding to other services. Many jurisdictions are exploring and expanding community-based options as alternatives to police response for individuals with behavioral health needs in particular. This session will provide an overview of the migration of law enforcement funding in an array of both small and large jurisdictions across the country from 2020 through about the end of 2021. We'll also discuss the traditional dual role of law enforcement across what we at PRA refer to as Intercepts 0 and 1 of the Sequential Intercept Model, and the importance of building community capacity while decreasing the footprint of the criminal justice system in order to work toward true systemic change. I'd like to mention a couple of disclaimers, for lack of a better word, before we begin. The first is to acknowledge the various perspectives around the word defund in particular, which has obviously attracted polarizing attention over the past 18 months or so. Defund is used by some groups to refer to general police reform and used by others who advocate for complete abolition of law enforcement and the prison system. What I'm going to share today around defunding the police aligns most closely with what the Fair Fight Initiative contextualizes as developing a strategy for redistributing state budgets in a way that creates a more equitable and fair system. So in this way, defunding fits within the larger context of justice reinvestment and shifting resources toward less punitive efforts. I also want to note that while many communities are implementing and exploring alternatives to law enforcement response across the country, including several presenting at this conference, this presentation will focus specifically on the funding aspect as well as restructuring response more broadly. So we won't dive very deeply into specific models, although I do have several resources to share on the topic. So first, I want to bring a little bit of broader context to this discussion, and that's around the modern dual role of law enforcement as both warrior or enforcer and guardian or legal protector. At PRA, much of our work revolves around the image you see here of the Sequential Intercept Model, or SIM. The SIM was developed in the early 2000s as a framework to overcome traditional boundaries between systems and agencies. The model informs community-based responses to the involvement of people with mental illness and substance use disorders in the criminal justice system. So we use the model as a strategic planning tool with communities to identify local gaps and resources and inform their responses to people with behavioral health needs who are within the criminal justice system or at risk of involvement with it. And that's where we look at Intercept 0. We often recognize the dual role of police at Intercept 0 and 1, as you can see in the red circle on the screen. We actually formally incorporated Intercept 0 as the most recent intercept in 2017 because we heard a lot of feedback from communities about how to engage police as partners with behavioral health and other community providers versus relying on police to provide appropriate care for people in distress. When we work with officers, we often acknowledge that likely none of them in the room intended to enter this field because they wanted to be the first person to respond to someone experiencing a crisis related to behavioral health or homelessness, nor are they sufficiently trained to do so. However, in most communities, calling 911 and facilitating a response by law enforcement is the first and sometimes the only option available to individuals, and much of our work explores what other possibilities there may be for diversion and more appropriate alternatives for vulnerable populations at the local level. To begin the conversation around law enforcement funding and allocation of public safety resources, here's some of what we know broadly. The money from policing, first of all, comes from local governments, state governments, and federal programs. However, most police funding comes from local governments. Based on data from the National League of Cities and the Urban Institute, spending on police overall is a function of historical factors and cost of living, but is not correlated to variation in actual changes in crime and safety. And I want to point out a couple of things specifically around this. It can be difficult to ascertain how much crime is in the US since much of it is unreported, but the two primary sources of government crime statistics are the FBI and the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Both the FBI and BJS data show dramatic declines in US violent and property crime rates since the early 90s, when crime spiked across much of the nation. It's also worth noting that the surveyed perception of many Americans is that there's actually more crime nationally than there was the year before, despite what we know is a general downward trend during this time. It is true in many places in the country that the number of homicides increased during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021, but most other forms of violent crime did not follow this pattern, or they've even dropped. It's also important to keep the larger historical perspective in mind, as homicide rates have shown a fair amount of fluctuation over the past 100 plus years and do not necessarily indicate an overall increase in crime rates or violent crime. But returning to police spending, we know that it has remained at roughly 4% since 1977. So while the total amount of dollars spent on police has increased significantly by many billions of dollars since then, the share or percentage of state and local spending going to police has not changed, despite huge variation in crime rates over that time period, and in particular, the decline that we've seen. So to summarize all this by quoting the National League of Cities, there is no research-based optimal level of police presence. I also want to highlight a couple of external resources before talking about what I've been tracking at PRA. So first of all, along the bottom of the screen, defundpolice.org is staffed by the Community Resource Hub, and it's a comprehensive website that follows legislation and policy reforms, both proposed, passed, and failed, including those surrounding budget and reinvestment. So they also have budgeting tools designed for community organizers and other stakeholders to calculate the cost of public safety strategies in their areas. You can find a lot of resources and tools here. Secondly, in the upper left-hand corner, the National Conference of State Legislatures hosts a database on their website to track law enforcement legislation that has been introduced in the 50 states and DC since about May of 2020. There's a broad range of legislation topics included on this site, and you're able to search keywords like budget or financing. I think this database is a really helpful tool in particular as police reform has slowed or stalled at the federal level, but we're seeing a lot more meaningful support and movement at the state levels. So my work within the topic has been tracking about 25 local jurisdictions across the country that have either pledged or made significant changes to law enforcement funding, particularly as they may reallocate some of that funding to behavioral health and community-based services. I first started compiling examples across a variety of jurisdictional sizes in the summer of 2020, and the resource was most recently updated in January 2022. It is primarily meant to serve as a resource for community stakeholders who want to see what's happening with law enforcement funding across the country or in different cities, and you can access it at prainc.com. You can see a screenshot here. There's also a shorter section in the document discussing jurisdictions that have canceled contracts with law enforcement departments operating in their schools or school resource officers. So what has happened? This December 2021 Newsweek article headline summarizes what we've really seen as the trend across many major cities, and you can also see that highlighted in a few examples here on the screen. So in July 2020, the New York City Council approved shifting roughly $1 billion away from their $6 billion NYPD budget, including reallocating about $350 million to mental health, homelessness, and education services. However, 1 year later, the approved budget actually increased NYPD funding by $200 million. So a percentage of the original cut, but still significant. Another example, Los Angeles in June 2020 voted to cut $150 million out of a total $1.8 billion LAPD budget, with the goal of redirecting funds toward community building projects and health and education initiatives in minority communities in particular. However, as of November 2021, the mayor's proposed budget for 2022 includes an increase of $213 million to the LAPD. An example of a smaller jurisdiction, Norman, Oklahoma, the city council voted to deduct $865,000 from the police department by eliminating 9 salary positions in June 2020. However, due to a lawsuit filed by the local Fraternal Order of Police, the vote to reallocate that funding was deemed not valid. A year later, the city council considered taking about $500,000 from the police department to use to fund a mobile crisis response unit, but they ended up leaving the department's budget intact and moving that money, about $500,000, from the general fund to pay for the unit instead. So you can see some additional examples listed here and others on our website, including Chicago, several other cities in California, Portland, Oregon, Washington, D.C., Newark, New Jersey, and other sites. But essentially many, although not all, as you can see in Seattle here, for example, many of the cities that made cuts to law enforcement funding since 2020 either funded budgets at the same level the following year or increased police spending. However, this is not the entire picture. While cities certainly did not defund their police departments, many of the budget increases were more complex than headlines would lead us to believe. Chicago, for example, increased their police spending, but the number of officer positions remained almost the same. In Ithaca, New York, a couple of hours west of me, their budget was increased by restoring 2 previously eliminated positions to fill vacancies, but the city also created and funded a Reimagining Public Safety Task Force to explore replacement of the department with a Department of Public Safety, which would include both armed public safety workers and unarmed community solution workers, and that's all still in progress. Increased city budgets across the country also included things like technology upgrades, such as body cameras, and additional staff to support law enforcement reform efforts. Another complex example to highlight is in Austin, Texas. So after a 2020 vote to reinvest about 1/3 of Austin's police budget in social services, the governor of Texas signed a law that would penalize cities financially for decreasing police department funding. So to avoid the penalties, cities had to allocate funding to police that was at least equal to their fiscal year 2020 budgets, which Austin did. However, in November 2021, Austin voters rejected by about 2-1 a proposition that would have forced the city to hire additional hundreds of police officers, indicating that reform is still a priority there. Since 2020, we've also seen an increase in voluntary law enforcement departures, whether through resignations or early retirements, which resulted in a lot of departments advocating to spend more money to recruit new officers for work that may now be considered less attractive. For example, in mid-2021, the mayor of Salt Lake City agreed to give the police department pay raises of nearly 30% for entry-level officers and 12% for senior-level officers, with the goal of attracting and retaining quality staff. Portland, Oregon increased their 2022 police budget by just over $5 million after cutting $15 million the prior year, but the added spending includes signing bonuses for new officers, funding a retire-rehire program, and bolstering recruitment due to their workforce gaps. Another issue has been sickness from COVID-19, which also exacerbated short-term staffing issues, leading to a need for increased overtime pay. We also know that when departments implement additional training that pulls officers from the field temporarily, such as de-escalation, crisis response, CIT training, they need additional staff to cover the time. So all of this has contributed to requests for increased police budgets across the country. Whether or not they defunded police, many cities made other changes to reduce law enforcement's footprint, such as Seattle removing officers from the city's navigation team, whose duties include removing encampments of people who are unhoused. Some cities funded new unsheltered outreach teams, mobile crisis response teams, community-based violence prevention programs, and civilian groups to respond to things like basic traffic enforcement and parking violations. Another good example is in Los Angeles. LA's 2022 proposed budget includes an increase in LAPD spending, but in 2020, voters also passed Measure J, which requires the county to allocate 10% of its general funds toward social and community services, including alternatives to incarceration. And central to that measure is a requirement that this money cannot be used for policing or prisons. Other communities have found separate pools of funding to support alternatives to police response. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, they raised their police department spending by about 4.5%, but that budget also contains $7.7 million for the city's new community safety department, which launched in September 2021 and is a new alternative to police and fire department response, or a third response. The new division deploys unarmed social workers, housing and homelessness specialists, and violence prevention coordinators directly from 911 dispatch, which reduces the reliance on law enforcement for many calls. So what's happened? While we haven't defunded or removed law enforcement from the majority of community response, the months following May 2020 were still a very powerful political window of time where campaigns across the country shifted the narrative toward really imagining alternative possibilities. In Minneapolis, for example, the ballot measure to dismantle the police force and replace it with a new Department of Safety did not pass, but the margin was fairly close. It was about 56 to 44%. And when asked, some who voted against the measure cited worries that the proposal had no concrete plan for how to move forward, and they warned that it would leave some communities already affected by violence potentially even more vulnerable. Many opponents of this measure also stressed the urgency of transforming policing in the city even without it passing. So this idea of identifying public safety strategies that do not rely on policing and giving duties to community groups with appropriate expertise certainly remains a focus. Also, the defunding or unbundling debate has often been framed as a false choice between supporting law enforcement and reforming police, which has led to intense political polarization, as we know. So while, again, we know that crime rates fluctuate for a variety of reasons and that a rise in homicides during the pandemic was seen across the country, including in cities that increased police spending, there has been a false narrative around this rising crime overall that has been really difficult to contain. According to an October 2021 Pew Research Center poll, the share of adults who say spending on policing in their area should be increased now stands at 47%, which is up from 31% in June 2020, although opinions do differ widely by race, ethnicity, and age. So to wrap up and summarize a little bit, I'd like to shift the focus away from only law enforcement funding and toward this larger conversation around making sure that money serves the public in the most appropriate way and that communities are safe, whatever that means to them, and deferring what that means to them to the people in the communities. Over the past several decades, we know that public institutions like housing, healthcare, education have been steadily defunded by budget cuts. We've also grown the number of issues we expect police to respond to, whether or not there should be alternative individuals and organizations with more tailored expertise involved. So in order to work toward true system change, we need to both decrease the footprint of law enforcement and the criminal justice system and build community capacity that includes a continuum of options from preventative to post-crisis or post-emergency, depending on types of needs. Services need to be timely, accessible, person-oriented, and tailored to individual needs, considering social determinants of health, including, very importantly, housing. We also need to consider both first response and potentially second response in many cases. So looking at what services are available or can be, and do people know how to access them without a call to police? It's also vital that we fund data-driven evaluation efforts and publicize what is working across various communities and especially diverse populations across the country toward the overall goals of improved public health and public safety. I very much appreciate the time today, and please feel free to contact me with any thoughts or questions around this topic in the future. My contact information is listed here on the screen. Thank you.